Good morning. I want to read this morning from Matthew 25:34. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you are blessed by my Father. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you cared for me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Amen. From 95, early 95, all the way through to 96, I was totally involved in them prisons. But one of the things that really bothered me, being in prisons, I travelled several places all over Britain and in the United States, but I'd never been in prisons like the prisons in Russia, or the conditions that, and it was freezing cold for most of the time, or it was roasting hot. And then the food was awful. The first time, I guess, was I went to Belgrade with Nina and Alex. She was my translator, and I guess that was when it first began. It sure it was when we first started in the prison. She was my translator. We went to. I just got a taste of what it was going to be like all over Russia. On our first journey, went to Belgrade. It was 17 hours on a train, and about 5-6 hours on a bus. And it was the conditions were really, really hot, and I was desperate for a drink. And Alex, the young Russian guy that was working with me, he pulled out this bottle of Coke and he took a drink of it himself. And there was a bunch of soldiers that nobody knew. He handed it round to them, and each one of them took a swig out of this bottle. And then it came to me, and I just looked at that, and I said, "Oh, no, I'm fine. Boy, I was gagging for a drink." And then we got on that bus and travelled. It was exhausting getting off the train, and we got on that bus, and finally we end up we're going to a place to go into the prisons. I think there was 4 prisons we were going to. But before we got there, we went to a man named Vasily, to his house. We were going to be staying there for a couple of days. Well, that afternoon at 4 o'clock, he had a crowd of local people coming in, and he'd asked me to preach, and I said I would. But he showed me around the place that day, and he had a huge backyard where he grew everything he ate. He grew in that backyard. It was probably about 100 yards square, 100 yards one way, 100 yards the other way. Pretty big yard, but he grew everything. He ate everything from it. That's how he lived. He ate from that garden of his. But in the middle of that garden, he showed me where the bathroom was, the restroom, and it was just a shed that he'd put together, and just a heap of mess in the middle of it all. So if I needed the bathroom, that's where I was to go. And it didn't look appealing at all. Well, then he informed me that supper was ready, and he had some soup kind of stuff. And I looked at his hands, and they were really filthy dirty. The old man's hands were dirty, been in that garden all day long. But he'd made this soup, and it was thick soup. And I ate it, and I watched Alec eating his, and he gulped it down. He ate it real quick, so I ate mine down real quick. And I can't even remember what it tasted like, whether it was good or bad. I guess I just ate. Just the thought of what was in that soup made me very uncomfortable, to say the least. And then he gave me a second bowl, and I ate that. And just about 5 to 4 people began to pile in. And I began to get a cold sweat. I felt kind of sick. And I thought to myself, oh. Then I preached for 40 minutes, and I promise you, I felt really bad. And then he asked me to preach all over again, so I did. And I preached again. And then I run straight out into that bathroom, into that yard. And I was sick in that yard all over the place. The smell of that place was disgusting. And then for 10 days, I stayed there. I ate that soup every single day. Booze, they call it. I forget that. But man, it was disgusting. But for 10 days, finally we gets back to Moscow, and Pastor Clinton said, "How go in those prisons, son?" I said, "It was really good, Pastor." I said, "Only one thing wrong. I was sick every day." He said, "Oh, you get used to that." And that's the way Pastor Glenn, and no sympathy, no nothing. I mean, in other words, you're going to get involved here, son. You get involved, and you take what comes. And so that's the way it was. But some of those prisons I was in Minsk one time in Belarus with Alex, and we got there early in the morning. We were standing outside the prison waiting to go in. And I noticed these ladies, they had like a white doctor's uniform, pinafore on, and they were, of all things, bending down in the grass and separating blades of grass and putting the middle blades in a bucket. And they were filling that up, and I wonder what the heck they were doing. They're going to replant it. What were they going to do? Well, at lunchtime that afternoon, that's what they ate, grass soup. I mean, I'm not kidding you. That's what they ate, grass soup. There was nothing else. Nothing else in that country. There was nothing on their markets, no meat, no nothing on their markets, nothing at all. And then there was another time this really happened. I got sick all the time. Every time I was in Russia, I was sick. The food didn't mean, and it was always dirty. But there was a time I was in that. I think it was about 4 or 5 of us in the bus that we bought, in the 4-wheel drive. Sorry, we were traveling into Siberia, and it was thick snow, and I wanted to be sick really bad, so I just opened the back window and got really sick and carried on driving. I forget how long the drive it was, but by the time we got to the prison was right on the bank, was right on the river, bank of a river. And we got inside, and the man in charge, the warden in charge, major, whatever his rank was, he asked me, he said, would you like something to eat? Well, I was hungry, and I said I would. And he gave us a bowl of soup, and that soup consisted of water and little fish, little tiddlers about that big. And I just watched Alec put his fingers in them and pull out them tiddlers and eat them. And so I did exactly the same thing. And boy, I tell you, that's what they had. And my heart was going out for them. But there was another time when we were in Siberia, this really happened. We would enter into the main gates, and a wagon come in. And it was an open wagon, and on that wagon was chickens, loads of chickens. And they were green, and they were off colour. They were all, no feathers on them, they were being cleaned and plucked. And they were like green coloured. And those prisons ate them things. And a couple of days later, the whole prison was really sick. They just ate what they had. And I'm telling you, even as I think about it now, my heart wells up. How rich we are and how spoiled we are. And those prisons I went to in Russia, they were like that all the time. I told you about the time I went into one prison in Siberia. The women, they were sick. I preached to the women, and they took me into a ward where the women had TB. And there was at least a dozen of them, and they were all in different stages, did no medicines, no nothing. And that's when Sister Brenda had sent me those medicines over. I guess it was a big container, but we was able to supply some needs, meet some needs. At least we had Tylenol, but they'd never seen nothing. I'd never been in a place like this in my whole life. And for the next year and a half, that's all I did, was go in them prisons, preach the gospel, watch men get saved. Went into one place where there was a man in charge of the prison, and he took me to his house, and he had infants in his house, a couple of little kids in his house. They were his children, and their bed consisted of orange boxes were made up to be their beds, and they had blankets on them. And it sounds appalling, but it was. And it was things I was learning about myself, how spoiled, how selfish we are. And it was 3 years altogether that I was in them prisons of Russia, and watched many get saved and come to know the Lord. But most of the people were desperate, hungry, cold, and most of the time I would cringe because I had no food to give to them. But I would preach the gospel and watch multitudes come to know the Lord. And what an amazing time I had in Russia. And And then in 90, I guess it was in 96, May of 96, I'd been to Brother Clenden's convention. And while I was there, I was invited to go to Peru and start in the prisons of Peru. So I decided that was the will of God for me. And you talk about a stark contrast, Peru and Russia. And on the next tape, I'll begin to talk a little bit about that. Sorry about this morning, but just remembering how bad it was, those conditions. It seems like it was something out of a horror story. But we put that School of Christ in over 61 prisons in Russia. And I remember one time, just as I closed this morning, I remember one time, it was all worthwhile. And it was where Clenden said, you'll get used to being sick. And sure enough, never got used to it, but it sure was sick most of the time. But I remember walking across the yard, and this was in Siberia, one early morning. And I was going to the chapel, or what we call the chapel. I was going to run the School of Christ. And when we got there, before they got there, they heard this Texas voice, Pastor Clendenin preaching. I heard him shouting, and it was amazing. He was doing the School of Christ, and there was a translator right behind him. So Russia was an incredible time of my life, but it was also a time to look in and check in my own life, how rich and how blessed that we are here in America. Tomorrow I will continue with talking about Lima, Peru, and the prisons there, and also the starting of Adullam House, the children's home. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Amen.